chairperson. And I just see that Akbar has joined us.
Assalamu alaikum, Akbar sahab.
Akbar, I think you are mute. You may be on mute, Akbar.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, fine now.
Alaikum. Yes.
Good morning, Arjun sahab.
Good, yeah.
Good morning.
I'm very happy to be with you.
Good morning, sir.
Yeah, I almost missed the whole thing because luckily I got a reminder just now, because for some reason I was thinking it was tomorrow night, not tonight. So I didn't realize, and I phoned Arjun and I said, "Is this a mistake?" He said, "No, India's ahead of us. We're behind." And I said, "Oh." So,
but willing to learn a lot of things from you people, I'm sure, whether we are ahead or behind. So since it is 8:30 now, I would invite Honorable Chairman sir to please welcome the panelists and everybody, please.
Professor Imran, dear friends studying in Canada, dear students, colleagues. As we all know that the world and our nation is at the midst of the lockdown and social distancing need of the hour. At the Department of Commerce, post the COVID-19 lockdown in India, the faculty continued teaching by the way of online classes, assignments, and assessment tools using online platforms as Zoom, Google Classroom, Google Notes, etc. Online webinars are being conducted across courses, and students are being exposed to the experts while sitting at home. And I tell you that we have ensured zero academic loss and increased student engagement and enhanced learning during the COVID-19 crisis. Dear friends, for a while now, educators around the world have been talking about the need to rethink how we educate future generations. It is in this background that we have three great scholars from Canada who will be sharing views about this scenario. I take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Akbar Saeed, who is currently Associate Professor of Information Systems in the Business Technology Management Program at Wilfrid L'Oreal University in Canada. He is the current director of the Tishopo Institute for the Study of Contemporary Africa, based at the same university. He teaches courses mainly related to technology and entrepreneurship, which includes cyber ethics, information and communication technology in the developing context and the entrepreneurial environment, specifically focused on startups. His research areas are generally centered on how technology influences both the way we understand ourselves and the way we operate in the world. We have another young gentleman, young scholar, Dr. Suhaib Riaz, who is an associate professor of management at the University of Ottawa, Canada. His research area is focused on challenges of current future global significance, such as inequality, socio-economic and political crisis, polarization, along with new organizing and social change initiatives that is involve social entrepreneurship and social innovation to address challenges in various global contexts. He brings laurels to the University of Ottawa, around 10 years of teaching and research experience, including most recently as an associate professor at University of Massachusetts, Boston, where he taught at the undergraduate MBA and executive MBA levels, and was also involved in via specialized lectures and supervisory roles in the PhD programs. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be having another gentleman, Dr. Arjun Bahradwaj, who is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Management at Kelowna campus of UBC. Prior to joining UBC, Arjun was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University. Earlier, Arjun completed his PhD in Business Administration from the School of Business, Western University. Arjun has diverse cross-cultural exposure and has lived, worked, and studied in 4 countries: Canada, India, Japan, and United States. I welcome you all, sir, to this great forum. I'm sure your views on this theme will be helping our students to decide their future courses of action. With these words, I welcome you once again. Thank you very much to be with us.
thank you.
Well, I consider this my prime duty to welcome once again all the panelists, attendees, and those audience on the YouTube, to welcome on behalf of the Honorable Vice Chancellor of the University. At the outset, I really must acknowledge a firm support emanating from a few persons. Of course, first in the list is the Honorable Vice Chancellor of AMU, Professor Tariq Mansoor, who happens to be an academician, who shared this vision with much enthusiasm and provided the encouragement and of course the basic paraphernalia to deliver. Then another person in line is Professor Baharul Islam, who is basically Dean Academics of IIM Kashipur and a good associate of mine. Then the third person who actually made the things go is Mr. Arshad Wahid Khan, who happens to be the Director of Software Development of Oracle at San Francisco. He gave me all the moral support to go ahead and advised me to really take up the responsibilities, no issues. Then I really acknowledge Mario Crotola, CEO of MBC Consultancy and Training Firm from Switzerland. I would also like to flag my friend and my student, Professor Zaid Ahmad Ansari, who is Director, Graduate Business School from Qasim University. And of course, none else than Dr. Arjun Bahradwaj from Canada, to whom we shall be interacting just now. Well, last in this list, but nevertheless, is of course my colleagues, whether it is Mohammad Mohsin Khan, whether it is Asif Ali Khan, whether it is Asiya Chaudhary, and of course the young brigade in the department, like we have Nayyar Rahman, Jahangir Chauhan, Nishat, Saleha, and all others. Of course, I mean, there are many, Muhammad Shamim Ansari, so many which need to be mentioned. Of course, we cannot mention all. And at the end, but the most vital, the student fraternity, who just shouted, "Go, sir, go," and here I am. So these are the people who supported me to treat in the relatively unknown path of online interaction. I'm thankful to each one of them from the core of my heart. Thank you, sirs. And I really mean it. I would love to really mention this. Then the idea of this webinar is to share the specific experiences during the present disaster and challenges to the world and the humanity. And presuming this, that Canada is academically a sound place, a heaven for the academicians, I would love to discuss these challenges and issues, and moreover, the post-COVID-19 strategies. The idea is that the world shares their experiences and we try to learn from each other's experiences. All this on a very positive note with a mindset to make a positive comeback. I recall a few verses, we shall overcome someday. So that's not an issue, inshallah, we shall come back. Without much of ado further, would like to initiate the discussion on the note that when it comes to the universities, then perhaps teaching, which I'm sure is effectively being taken care of by the Canadian faculties. Then there is another issue which the world is staring at as examination, research, and so many things that need to be looked at. So I would request the panelists to please take charge, take the baton, and discuss their best of the practices so that we people look at you to learn things. Thank you. Please.
Arjun, you
thank
can share
you,
the format and we can then start.
Thank you, Professor Saleem, Professor Khan. I mean, first of all, this is such a pleasure in the ongoing COVID crisis. You brought the whole world together. So thank you for organizing this. Thank you for bringing us together. This is a tremendous opportunity for all of us, and maybe it'll open up opportunities for future collaboration in a variety of different ways, which we haven't even thought about. Yeah. So what I'd like to do is actually just maybe talk a little bit about the format for the session in terms of how we would like to do it. And so what we envisaged was, that we would have each of the panelists just talk about themselves a little bit, about a couple of minutes.
Sure.
And then, I will talk about the format of the session, and then we will go into the format. So I'll actually hand over to Akbar to talk a little bit about himself and introduce himself a little bit more, and then we'll
most welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say that thank you for the opportunity to speak here. I am very honored and it's my great pleasure because I've heard a lot about Aligarh University. I've never had the opportunity to interact with anybody, but I know it has such a rich history in India, and therefore it's it is my honor to be able to speak with you today. I'm not going to talk too much about myself because Professor Ali Khan gave a very good introduction to me. But what I would like to do is to focus a little bit on the technology aspect of as we talk about the context of the university and how they're dealing with the COVID-19 and the fact that this kind of social isolation the situation that we're put in. And obviously technology is going to be playing a very, very big part in all of this. And I happen to be professor of technology. And I do a lot of, as my introduction indicated, thinking a lot about what I call the technological way of thinking, and how when technology permeates society in different areas, we tend to start to think in a very, very technological way. And I'm going to explain what that means, give you a little bit of background, and then just kind of, and then relate it to the university and teaching in particular. So this technological way of thinking, whenever technology is brought in to solve a particular problem, we start to understand that problem and the context of that problem in a very, very technological way, or a very different way than we're used to thinking, right? And so let me give you an example. I studied, for my thesis research, I studied the healthcare system in Canada. And one of the things that was happening in healthcare is happening in Canada is that we are starting to use a lot more technology. And there's a big, big focus on bringing more technology into healthcare and for healthcare professionals to use technology. The problem is that we have understood the problem in healthcare as a technological or informational problem. When the problem is informational, we bring information technology to solve that problem, right? And it's what we call a very manageable problem then, because you say, wow, the lack of information flow is the problem. Let's bring in technology and it will solve all the problems in the system. The problem is that it's not really an informational problem. It's a problem of collaboration, that healthcare professionals don't collaborate very well. Technology will never solve a collaborational problem. We can spend millions and billions of dollars on technology, but our problem will still not be solved because the problem is a mindset with the healthcare professionals. It's one of collaboration. So therefore, I predicted that all this money that we're spending in healthcare to try to bring try to solve more issues and healthcare issues within the system is not going to be solved by information technology. I mean, just give you an example of Facebook and all these different social medias. Well, these social medias, do they actually help us collaborate more, or do they exchange information? Right? They tend to exchange information very well. Think about Facebook friends, right? Facebook friends versus real friends, right? Facebook friends, we can have thousands and thousands of Facebook friends, but they're not really deep friendships usually with Facebook friends, because it's just about exchanging information, exchanging a picture. So information technology does very well and does a very good job of exchanging information. So I'm actually doing a little bit of research in a wider space. Just as an aside, I'm in the process of putting together material for a book where we're looking at technology in humanitarian spaces for humanitarian causes. So we use technology to try to solve particular problems, and what ends up happening invariably is we get unintended consequences. Some other issue emerges from that. So I've published a paper and done some research on fuel-efficient stoves. I'm looking at mosquito nets as an example to tackle the problem of malaria. And so we, give out these technologies like these mosquito nets to poor people to try to, prevent the spread of malaria and them getting bitten by mosquitoes. But what they're doing is they're not using it for sleeping under, they're using it to fish in streams. And then they're causing all kinds of ecological problems because they're picking up all the little small fish as well as the big fish, and this is causing an ecological disaster. So again, technology is being used to solve a particular problem because we have a very, very simple technological understanding of that problem, which oftentimes avoids the larger context. Okay, so having understood that and knowing that there's unintended consequences, let me bring it down to COVID-19 and what universities are doing. What I'm seeing, and I'm looking for, my interest very much is in unintended consequences. We're very early on in the stage of trying to, of understanding what those unintended consequences are going to be. Because right now, we're just starting to understand how to deal with this, right? Universities, at least in Canada, are really starting to, because when the pandemic was declared, it was kind of the end of the last term. And so the last few classes, most professors either didn't have the classes or they just did some very, very basic stuff and finished up the term. The real term is going to be starting in about 2 weeks, and that's the term that I'm involved in teaching. So I haven't actually taught in this environment up till now. But what I can say in terms of my observations is, number one, there is a differential effect of the technology and the use of technology to teach. And what I mean by differential effect is that the certain subjects and certain professors are having a very easy time at putting a lot of their content online. And by the way, we are not calling it, at least at my university, we are calling it remote learning, not online learning. Online learning is in the online environment. Remote learning is kind of a hybrid, right? We try to kind of make it in such a way that, you know, we understand that students aren't close to where we are, and now what kinds of means do we use to kind of teach? And so that's one thing, that the certain professors at our university are having a very hard time because of the subject matter that they try to teach. It doesn't go very well with the technological environment. So that's number one. Secondly, I'm seeing that there's a very, and I think Professor Saleem might have mentioned in his opening, there seems to be what I call an undue focus on cheating, in the sense that we seem to be much more in tune to the fact that students may cheat within this environment as compared to a regular classroom, right? That the technology seems to enable students to perhaps cheat, and therefore we have other technologies that we bring to try to prevent them from teaching. Like, for instance, we use something called Respondus Monitor, which basically locks down the browser. It doesn't allow them to do searching, but it also looks at the environment, and they could have, and now in the latest discussion a couple of days ago, there was a discussion of students who have this camera who's looking to see what they're doing, and some of them are taping cell phones or smartphones onto their monitor on the side, and they can actually use that without anybody even knowing. And so whatever technology they bring to try to limit students, students seem to be, or maybe it's just our understanding of that, they seem to be trying to get around that. And thirdly, it's also a limitation of the technologies itself, right? So we're finding also that, in my program, the students are very technologically oriented. I teach in a business technology management program. So they tend not to have very many issues, but some of the students don't have the technologies, the hardware, the software, the bandwidth in order to deal with such an environment, right? And sometimes they don't even have the spaces. Some of the professors don't have, nice offices in which they can teach classes. They have, smaller houses, and they have kids running around, and, all of these things, where some of us are in a much, better situation. We've got isolated offices and things. So again, there seems to be a very differential effect, not just on faculty, but also on students. And so to kind of conclude my statement here, my opening thoughts, on a go-forward basis, I'm very interested, and maybe it's something that we as academics, especially administrators, should kind of keep an eye out as to how does, once we get through this kind of social distancing and get a little bit further on, and we get back to kind of somewhat of a normal situation, how is it going to affect the way that we understand education itself, right? Are we going to have a more technological understanding of education, right? So what are the long-term effects of that? And that's something that we won't know right now, but later dates, as things start to unravel and unfold, we'll start to figure that out. That's what I wanted to say.
Very true, Akbar Sahab. I think this is very important. Each of the country has two set of people where basically have and have not section. The proportions may differ, and have section has the ethical issues for better use of the technology. Anyway, so we just as the professors really have to work out a strategy where we are able to restore the ethical issues along with the technological use.
Right. You know what? I just want to say that the privilege, you relate to the privilege, like many students that go to university are somewhat in the privileged class, right? Many of them, they have the means, right? Just to give you an example, at the secondary school level in Ontario, because everything has gone online as well, there is a lot more of a differential between people, the haves and the have-nots. And so what the government has done is they've come out with a program where all the households which don't have computers, they're giving them tablets, right? Tablets for each of the households in order to try to kind of level the playing field a little bit, right? So those kinds of issues are definitely there and something to think about.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Akbar. This was really an excellent introduction and gave us a lot of food for thought as we move forward. I'll just actually, in terms of, moving on, what we would like to do is actually have Suhaib introduce, the challenge around the linkages of university with societal challenges. And then I'll briefly talk a little bit about the challenges to research. And beyond that, we would actually like to really keep it like an interactive forum. So we would like to invite, I noticed 52 participants here, invite questions from the audience and others, and also, and then open up the discussion to the panelists. So with that,
I'll come in at the end, Arjun, because I'll tie it together for the societal implications.
Okay.
That's a larger perspective, I believe. Very correct. That would be in order.
Okay, thank you. So basically, I mean, just to add to, in terms of my experience, to what Akbar was saying, just in terms of my personal experience, I am very technologically challenged. So, we had to a 2-day notice, for example, to move to online teaching. And this was really very, very difficult for me, but we had good support and somehow I managed. And there's quite a few things in terms of, what Akbar was saying in terms of, certain things being difficult and certain things being easy. So one of the challenges, what Akbar said, was about remote and online, so synchronous and asynchronous. So for example, when I was teaching, my students had already gone back to Spain, to other parts of the world, in India and China, and they were on very different time zones. So when I started the class, it was midnight in China, for example, and these students had returned, right? So so I started getting emails, for example, how do I come to a class at that time? And so that got me thinking as I prepared for the challenge in the term in September when I'll be teaching, is that we have to increasingly think about also asynchronous. So, in terms of people being in different time zones or have different preferences for time in terms of attending the class. And that would be something important. The other thing, in terms of my personal experience, my initial experience was, it was a very dehumanizing experience for me. So talking in front of a screen, and then also not, there might be pretenses of what the students were doing on the other side. Maybe they were watching Netflix or watching movies so I didn't enjoy it very much. And I also thought about some of the challenges which would arise, because there is a lot of value which comes when we bring students together in physical space. For example, it's very important for building friendships. I do research on networks, so it's very important for lifelong networks which people build at, for example, a leading institution like Aligarh and other leading universities in the world. And also for character building, some of the issues which Akbar talked about in terms of the issues of integrity. Maybe there is greater opportunities for doing some of that in a face-to-face environment. So that was just my thoughts on teaching, and really my I would like to talk a little bit more about research, right? In terms of what are some of the initial things which have been happening. So when COVID came, there were sudden closures. And obviously, this brought a lot of challenges. And so in terms of the adaptation, what are some of the things which the universities in Canada are doing in terms of the initial adaptation? So one was obviously, a lot of things had to come to a stop, right? So they said, well, a lot of people will have to stop research. And so only the labs which were, were really essential for keeping them open so people could actually go to the university, because some chemicals have to be poured and so on. But simultaneously, also there were initiatives to launch some COVID-linked research. So there was immediate funding, for example, which came out for research, both in the sciences on COVID-linked issues, as well as research in social sciences. So for example, COVID and mental health issues, the impact of isolation, for example, on mental health, mindfulness practices and their benefits when you are in isolation, increase in physical violence, for example, in homes when, and obviously, as Akbar was saying, we have to think about some of the unintended consequences. So some of the unintended consequences, as we are seeing, are also turning out to be very positive. So for example, the impact on environment. I read stories from India, for example, where people in Jalandhar are able to see the mountain ranges in Himalayas. And today there was a story about Saharanpur. So there is also positive changes, unintended consequences, which might also bring shifts into, focus of research and so on. The other long-term challenge in terms of research which would emerge is really around funding. For example, a lot of universities in Canada depend on international tuitions. So a lot of international students come in who pay higher tuition fees, for example, and they are a very important source of funding. So, what will happen to the incoming class in September, and what impact would it have on funding? And obviously, this is also an economic crisis. So currently, the Canadian government has done a very good job in terms of, providing wage support and sustaining employment. But how long will this last, and how long can we survive this economic challenge? And if there is an economic challenge, obviously there's consequences on the universities, right? So that would also be very important in terms of research. So those are my initial thoughts in terms of, some of the immediate issues in terms of how universities are handling it, and also, some of the longer term things that we will have to think about.
But Arjun, I think we need to understand that perhaps we need a combination of, virtual as well as the real world. So I don't think there should be a challenge to the education industry as such, whether it is Canada, or any of the developed world, where lots of hordes of people go for higher education. And because you rightly said that character building and other issues are there, which need to be, perhaps it will be difficult to address at the virtual sites.
Yes, yeah, that's a great point. And even, when I was teaching, I could see a lot of immediate benefits. For example, just to point out to a couple, I use cases. So this is an interactive format where students in the classroom, they raise hands and speak. And typically, there's a set of students who always speak. But when I was doing it online, and I saw a lot more participation, for example, through chat for people who were not participating. So there was
that is what I also noted. Very true.
Yeah, so different set of engagement, for example, right? And a different set of people engaging with this process. Also I noticed, for example, just in terms of, the names popping up all the time. So my memory of the name became a lot more stronger. So I could connect the faces.
Very correct for the older generation.
Yeah. So, there would be a range of benefits, and obviously you're absolutely right in terms of combining both the offline and online would offer value. But again, we will also have to simultaneously think is what is the value of this university education when, for example, people can pull in courses on Coursera and WebEx and have a program running.
So,
yeah, I think I'll hand it over to Suhaib now. Yeah?
Okay, thank you once again for inviting me to this, really delighted. So I just want to add and tie in some of the comments that we heard. And I think the first thing I want to do is just maybe broaden the discussion to all stakeholders of the university, right? Most of the time we think about faculty and students, but if we're going to think about the wider role of the university in society, then we have to think about who are the other stakeholders of the university. What is happening in the communities around the university, right? And because that's where, our past, present, and future stakeholders are. So, for each university, it will differ. I can give you one quick example of what was happening here at my university. So, the residences of the students had to be emptied. They had to be made vacant, right? What we call hostels in India, for example, or in England. So those residences had to be made vacant. Now, I've been in North America for over 20 years. And so the first thought that I had was, what about international students, right? Because a lot of my students were international, and some of them may have spent just months here or maybe a year or 2 years. And so that, I'm just talking about how we have to broaden little by little our understanding of the stakeholders. And so, just behind the scenes, I reached out to some students who were international students, and I asked them to start communicating with the university, and behind the scenes with the university, initiated this communication. And the university was already sort of thinking about this. And what ended up happening is some sort of a forum where students were able to put forward their views, and it was sorted out, and international students were allowed to remain on campus. An exception was made for them, which was absolutely essential. Can you imagine in the middle of a crisis being pushed out of a residence and going out and trying to find a place to rent and so on in a place where you are new? So, but the key lesson that I'm trying to sort of share here for me was that we need to broaden our understanding of stakeholders. There may be, you mentioned, Professor Saleem, you mentioned the haves and have-nots, right? The definition of haves and have-nots may also be changing, right? A lot of the international students, we would never have thought of them here as have-nots. They actually pay twice the fees when they come here. But then in that situation, they became the most vulnerable community, right? And so in other places, perhaps in India around, Aligarh, we can think about other stakeholders of the university, people who are working on a contract basis, right? When we think about have-nots, right? People who are not permanently employed, what is their situation, right? There are movements happening here in Canada, such as, the people who work, on the daily wage basis or on a contract basis, or work in the informal economy. So some of us are basically handing them out tips, even though they're not working right now. So they would, for example, people who would come to clean your home and so on. So these are some, I'm just sort of sharing this to help the universities think about wider stakeholders that depend on the university, but we may not be thinking about them. So that's my immediate thought. But it also triggers a thought about the big picture of what is the fundamental role of a university in society. And I have been reflecting on this a lot, and particularly looking at what is happening across the world, what is happening in India. And I think it is a teaching moment in that respect. On one side, you have the role of universities, which is essentially about creating systematic and transparent knowledge. And on the other side, we are living in a world which is full of fake news, rumors, falsehoods of all kinds, prejudices of all kinds. And I think this is where the role of the university becomes crucial in society, right? It's a teaching moment. The university has to start communicating and become a repository of the correct kind of knowledge and information, right? This would be the wider role of the university. And I think it's not just for faculty to do this. It's for every individual. We have to empower the students, we have to empower the staff, we have to empower anyone connected with the university to start thinking of their own role as an agent for sharing that kind of knowledge, right? And so this is, I think, a teaching moment. The second part of that is, I think it's also a moment to open up our minds more globally, right?
That's very good.
Because, it's in a really weird way, this crisis has also connected us globally. I mean, this webinar is a great example, and, all credit to the organizers for thinking globally at this moment, right? So we have to also start thinking of learning across borders, connecting across borders, reaching out, and understanding the commonalities of problems at universities, different universities, right? For a long time, there's been this, it's always there. We talk about it, let's talk about things across borders, let's discuss these things, but it should actually start happening. Academics across borders, right? That should sort of become a real mission for a lot of us, right? So that is my other thought. I think just as a closing statement, so I was thinking if we tie all this together, then what kind of a role do universities have today, particularly in this crisis and then post-crisis, right? And the one thing I could think of is that we have to go back to thinking of universities as social movements. And it's interesting that you are organizing this from a university which actually started out as a social movement. This was known as the Aligarh movement, right? So if you tie my thoughts there and Akbar and Arjun's thoughts there together, and you think about that's the role of the university, right? The role of the university is to change society for the better. It's upliftment through knowledge, right? Through sorting out, through a difference between falsehood and correct knowledge, right? So if your founder was there today, you can well imagine what side he would be on, right? Because he essentially lived this exact thing of, well, let's create a hub for systematic, transparent knowledge and open our minds globally. He went to Oxford, he went to Cambridge, and he said, we need to learn from across borders, across barriers, overcome our own prejudices, help others overcome their prejudices, right? And so I think that's clearly the role that universities will have to take going forward. I mean, it's in the anthem of the Aligarh University, right? We have seen the defeat of falsehood here, right? देखी है खुद आँख से हमने देखी है बातिल की शिकस्ते फाश यहाँ. So I think that's what I'm trying to say. That's the role of the university, to have that clear separation. It is our job to help society sort out between real knowledge, and defeat the falsehoods, the prejudices and rumors and so on, which in the moments of crisis, you see they become really a crucial part of people's behaviors and what is happening right across the world. Right? So I think that's the statement I would end with, that we have to think of universities as social movements.
Listening to you, Riaz, really put me in a student mode. And thank you. I'm deeply indebted while you rightly mentioned the Aligarh movement. And I'm sure that a silver lining of post-COVID-19 is that education system is likely to really move as a movement, as an international movement, where we can connect either way. It's a forward linkages, maybe with the international teaching fraternity and the trainers and all those, and it's a backward relationship with the masses, because we had not only experienced our teaching learning exercise with the students, that where sometimes even the parents peeped in, what are you doing? Is it really a class? Oh yes, good, you are having class sitting at home. So that's a very good connect, I believe. So you very rightly said things are changing and likely to change, and we should take advantage of it as a movement. Very correct, sir. Thank you. I'm really, sir, please. In fact, it is your cup, please.
Okay.
How do we take questions? I'm not sure, Arjun. Do we know how we're doing that?
So I'm on the, if you go to your chat screen, there is questions which are already showing up. So if you can open.
Yeah, so I saw some of those, but just wanted to check with Professor Saleem. Do we have another process?
It's perfectly all right. You can take up the questions which you think are relatively more important, and we can go ahead with this.
Okay. So I mean, just to follow up on the thought which Suhaib had brought to the fore, is really the role of universities as social movements. And I think about, particularly societies which are highly unequal. So, where society, so just to give you a context, for example, I mean, Akbar talked about inequality within Canada, but in general, the Canadian society is fairly egalitarian if you're comparing between countries. So, for example, the healthcare coverage in Canada is universal. So everybody has access to healthcare, irrespective of whether, they are rich or poor and so on. So this is almost, this is a universal right for every resident and citizen of Canada. Similarly, most of the education in Canada is really through public institutions. So universities which are publicly funded, so through government, with a little bit of exception. And where access is again, taking to Akbar's point into account, but generally accessible. In contrast, when I see, countries like India, there has been a much lower investment in, say, public education in schools, in healthcare. And so when we start talking about universities as social movements, isn't there a risk of they're becoming very elitist social movements when we haven't made these investments in large public investments in public education, for example, even at the school level, and public health and so on. And that kind of ties up to the question I see from Dr. Shalini Sharma here, and this is to all panelists. Says, is it possible for universities to be transparent for their role regarding society? Because there are challenges, right? Are they too elitist, for example, in the context? Yeah, so it's open to, yeah.
Akbar, do you want to comment on that? You're on mute, Akbar.
Oh, sorry. No, I haven't. Sorry, the question again was whether is it possible for universities to be transparent in. Okay, so I mean, in terms of the idea of, I mean, this is the Dr. Riaz Suhaib is giving me a lot to think about myself in terms of the role of universities, but I tend to agree that it is, if you look at the profession itself that we're in, the fact that we're able to move anywhere across the world and take academic appointments in any university would perhaps suggest kind of this, as Professor Saleem was saying, this kind of fraternity that we have among ourselves. And in fact, the challenges that universities face in Canada, there's lots of commonalities in India or in Pakistan or in any other countries, around the world. But there's lots of commonalities in terms of the relationships between professors and students and courses and all of this stuff that goes along, which is why people are able to move very, very freely across the world to different countries. So I think that if you look at the history of universities as being very, very elitist from when their initial conception, especially in the West, very kind of ivory tower. And I think that we, in general, and again, I don't have experience except for in Africa. Last summer I was teaching in Africa, but I can say to the Canadian experience that, and my university in particular, that we've tried to do, I direct an Africa Institute, Research Institute, and one of the things that we have tried to do is to try to reach out to different stakeholders, as Dr. Riaz says, looking at beyond the students, but also community members and others who. So, for instance, we started to look at refugees coming from African countries. And even we're a research institute focused on Africa itself, but we have widened out our understanding of who comes within our scope, right? So anybody to do with Africa beyond the academic institution is part of what we do. And the reason we do that is because I think universities in particular are able to think differently. Like I'll use the slogan of Apple computers, think differently. In times of crisis, we want different thinking, right? We can never excel, and I can't remember the saying and who said it, but we can't excel by thinking the way that we always do, right? That if we want something new, we want some innovation, it's got to be at a different level. And I think universities are perfectly equipped to do that because we don't have the kind of the economic, what's the word for it? Like, in the sense that the environment within which you operate is very, very free and open, right? We have, academic integrity. We have lots of things at the university that are in place to protect our way of thinking, to allow us to think differently than the establishment, right? So when people are thinking that the earth is flat, somebody comes along and thinks that the earth is round, and they get, in regular society, they get thrown in jail and all that kind of stuff. But in the university, we can go out there, we can publish that, and we can do that to kind of spur people's thinking, right? So that then we can kind of progress. So I think in these times, especially in the times of this pandemic, we need to be thinking differently about all the things that we're doing. I think universities are and I think they can be very transparent about that, because I think that is part of our history. No matter which university you look around the world, that is very much part of our history and our DNA.
Yeah, I just want to add that I think it's not just about, is it possible for universities to be transparent about their role? I think it is the duty of universities to have a role in society. And that's why I started by talking about stakeholders, which Akbar again alluded to. As we broaden our understanding of who are our stakeholders, gradually you will start thinking about them, and then you will start understanding the role of the university in a slightly different way. And that's why I mentioned the movement and the Aligarh movement, right? The university was one part of that movement, right? But the university does not exist for itself. As faculty, as students who are being, we don't exist for ourselves. The idea is to have the university for society, right? And that's why it was part of a social movement. So yes, it can be hard in certain cases to get involved in complex issues that are happening outside campus and so on. But as Akbar said, we are also bound because of the privilege that we have, right? I mean, we have a lot of freedom, we have intellectual freedom. And if we think more globally about this, we can get views from people around the world. For example, if there are contentious issues going on in one particular location, and if universities find it challenging to get involved in that, you can involve global experts, right? So there are ways to overcome these and fulfill that role of the university, I think.
Yeah, can I just say add to one thing that just came to mind too? I think we as universities, we also need to, and it's a very, very kind of touchy subject with me, because I've been thinking about this for a very long time, but I think we need to widen our research, right? We need to, we tend to focus our research on very, very academic topics, but I think we need to start thinking more about real kind of grounded research, right? Then that idea of transparency doesn't become an issue anymore, because people know what we're doing, right? Because right now, I think that we're isolating ourselves in some ways, right? And when we're isolating ourselves, then people don't really understand what it is that we're doing. But if we start to come out with perspectives and viewpoints on real non-academic topics, real practical topics, I think that will automatically put us in that position, right? So I think, and then part of the issue, at least in the West here, is the whole 10-year process that we have in place, that for the first 4 or 5 years, academics have to publish in, top journals, and therefore those journals are usually read only by the, other academics, right? They're not things that, so this is one reason, as an example, why my next project is a book, right? Because I want to write a book, and not an academic book, but a book that is going to be accessible to people who work in humanitarian spaces, right? So I think these kinds of things is what we have to start thinking a little bit more serious about.
Yeah, well, thank you. And Akbar, I think great insights, both Suhaib and Akbar. And actually, the next two questions, Akbar, might be actually maybe right up your alley. So they are on technology and integrity issues. So I will read the two questions one after the other, and then maybe you can, think. So to what extent technology favors more the development of universities as training institutions rather than educational institutions? And then there is another question around student assessment and examination is one of the key challenges to universities in this crisis. Can you elaborate a little more regarding that in terms of how? So the first question, maybe we can turn the order around: student assessment, examination, and really a challenge to integrity of the institution. And then also, is really technology shifting universities into training institutions rather than educational institutions?
Yeah, excellent question. And this is exactly my point, that when I was talking about the technological way of thinking, this is what my biggest fear is. And I'm a student of a philosopher named Heidegger, who wrote in an essay called The Question Concerning Technology, where he talked about technology and the huge benefits of technology, and also the dangers of technology. But he also kind of said that within technology is also the saving grace. So it's kind of that dual aspect. But this is the problem, right? That when we involve more technology, and in many ways we are being forced to use more technology as a result of this crisis, and when we are forced into that position, this technological understanding of education starts to permeate and starts to gain an upper hand and starts to marginalize other ways of understanding education, right? And so, this kind of training perspective, I think is very crucial to understand, because that is a very, very direct way of imparting knowledge to people and to students, and that becomes a way of going forward, and therefore marginalizes other. So people now in the future, as they come up with other ideas, they may in fact be like, I'll just give you a quick example. At my university, I teach a course on ethics, cyber ethics, so the ethics of technology, and we have we're scheduled to do 2 sections. And the director was thinking that combining, now that we have to teach it online, let's combine the 2 into 1 section, right? Why do we have to have 2 sections? And I pushed back. I said, no, when the class gets too big, even in an online environment, it becomes difficult to have the dialogue that we want, especially with ethics, where we need a lot of reflection. But that possibility was never considered before. Right? They never thought about combining the 2 into 1 until the fact came that we have to use technology, right? So now we're starting to think differently about the way that we're teaching, right? Not just us, but also administrators. So what was the second question? Oh, so you're muted, Arjun. You're muted.
Can I just mention one point, Arjun?
Yeah, sure.
See, perhaps it's a crisis hour where we are overemphasizing on the use of technology in the universities. I believe the combination of the 2 has to go. See, the only thing is that we have to cull out the best of the benefits possible through the use of better technology, better use of it. And I believe that the university will have to ultimately go in its own form.
Yeah.
I don't see that the relationship between teacher and taught can just be done away. No way. I strongly feel, because see, when we start discussing across the table, it's a different feel. It's a different relationship, and that has to be met. It's more human when compared to just talking to the machines.
Yeah.
So I think, there has to be a combination of the 2. Sir, please.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that point. And so, again, and tying to what we are, coming back to our conversation on in terms of inequality and access challenges, there's a very nice question here from Asia. And she writes, the present situation presents a biggest challenge first in how to access universally all the receivers. All students will have to be provided free or subsidized access to software. And so it's just maybe the structural inequality would come into play here also, that people just might not be able to access education just because of, the requirements of technology, for example, to do that, right? And so that's again a very, very important question. And also maybe ties to kind of what Suhaib was saying in terms of thinking about universities as social movements. So really thinking about also issues of inclusion and widening our nets in some sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to just say to that quickly. I know Suhaib wants to say something. In Canada, talking to the Canadian situation, even though there's many people who have access to technology, there are places in the north where they do not have very good access to technology, and therefore it has become a real problem in terms of the not just universities, but in terms of remote learning. Right, that at the lower levels of like within the schools and things like that, and so that's something that they're specifically addressing, because people that have are underprivileged are even more underprivileged as a result of this this crisis that we're facing, and so those pockets and those differential aspects become much more accentuated in this kind of crisis. Go ahead, Suhaib.
Yeah, I think great example by Akbar, because that was one of the points I was making with the idea of stakeholders, that sometimes we forget about them. We just forget that there may be students from those kinds of communities, even in Canada, with those access issues, or maybe in lockdown in some of those places. I think we don't have the time maybe to solve this right now. It's a real problem. Differential access is a real problem, but I think we can think about the process of solving it, right? So I'll go back, right? We can think about the process. We cannot solve it we probably within the confines of this panel. And I think the key thing in the process, if I'm reflecting on my earlier thoughts about stakeholders and the example that I mentioned here of stranded students, whether they are internationally stranded or they're stranded across state borders, or in this case, they are students who don't have access to the technologies. The key thing in terms of process is to listen to different stakeholders. There has to be a concerted effort to listen to them. And that's what I tried, as I said, sort of behind the scenes. When the thought occurred to me, I sent out an email personally to students that I knew internationally. I said, what's happening to you? What's your day like? Tell me about it. What are your problems? What's on your mind? So I think that has to be done as the starting part of the process. If we listen to these students more carefully, and then we can understand their access issues, and in consultation with them, possibly some solution can emerge, right? The role of the government is also important here. I would also maybe, again, with the whole idea of social movement and stakeholders, I would say that the university, particularly universities with large and strongly connected alumni, such as the Aligarh University, they need to think about this as a large scale effort where perhaps alumni can give some donations, can get involved here, because this is a crisis, right? We are in a crisis time. And if these are access issues, then you have to basically connect and think of cross-sector partnerships here, right? So you may have some social enterprises, some charity organizations, some alumni funds. At the same time, you may have some government funds and all that. And, and then you have to connect that with what are you hearing from the students? What are their needs? There are some cases here in Canada, Akbar, I think it's Ontario University, I forget which one, where I believe York University actually ordered a whole bunch of computers on rent for their students, right? They just rented a lot of computers. That was an option available to them here, right? So these large scale efforts have to be done, but I think in the context of Aligarh and in India, you need to have multi-sector involvement here. It's not going to be easy.
And it's going to be a long-term intervention. It can't be met immediately. It's very true.
And meanwhile, I think flexibility is also very important. I faced a situation similar to what Arjun faced, where, within 2 days, we had to switch to online. And the first thing I promised my students, I said, I am going to be flexible. I will work with your options, right? What are the options available to you? Let's figure that out. And I can sort of customize my course requirements to those so that I can get you to fulfill the requirements of the course without lowering the standards, but being very flexible. So again, it's the concept of listening. So I was listening to them. I did not force them. There were students who had to do presentations. I did not say, hey, use this software, do it this way, come on Zoom, do Microsoft Teams, none of that. So what are the options that work for you? This works for you, so we're going to do that. If you can, and so in certain cases, I had to do a presentation that was sent in by a student, a PowerPoint presentation with, and this goes to technology, with audio embedded in that PowerPoint presentation. So it was not live. The student prepared it, sent it to me. I posted it to the class, and then there was a discussion around that. So these sort of solutions will emerge if we are in dialogue with the people involved. We have to be flexible.
Very true.
Well, I think we are getting close to, towards the end of our time here.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just if any of you have the last few thoughts to kind of wind this up, a couple of thoughts I have is around, when you think about the role of universities in society, as Suhaib was pointing out, in terms of, thinking ourselves as social movement, it's really, we have to take up more important as a role as a voice of reason and rationality, in these societies. And I agree with Professor Saleem in terms of teaching how, I think we will be moving towards a more blended environment of online and offline, and where we will probably leverage some of the advantages of both of them. And with that, I'll just pass it on to other panelists. So I'll pass it on to the
I will. Yeah, I just kind of my final thoughts is that, as we go further with this crisis, at the present time we are in social isolation, and as Professor Saleem says, that the ultimate solution is to kind of combine technology, and kind of use technology to aid in our teaching. But right now, because of the situation, we are remote, and so technology kind of supersedes everything. Be careful, to all of us who are involved in the university system and associated with universities, be very careful and cognizant of the way that the technological understanding particular environment. And when that happens, it was going to marginalize other ways of thinking. Right. And so we should be, the way to kind of address that is to be very cognizant of that when that happens, and don't let that happen. Let's take a more balanced view. Let's take a more equitable view across, in terms of how we use technology. Don't use technology as the ultimate solution, right? So sometimes we worship technology and think it's going to do, everything for us, when in actual fact, it creates more issues and more problems. So we need to have a much more balanced view. That's what I would kind of advise people. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to conclude by maybe on a more positive note. I know this is a crisis, and all of us are facing all different kinds of challenges, some more than others. But as I think this webinar also demonstrates, there's also some opportunities here, right? A crisis is time for reflection. A crisis like this is a time for connecting with people you've not connected with before.
That's very true.
In a weird way, distances are actually reduced, because for me to talk to somebody, at a 20-minute drive at University of Ottawa right now is literally the same effort that it is for me to talk to you guys 10.5 hours away, right? So those distances should shrink in our thinking too. It's an opportunity for that. We should try to connect. We should try to overcome our own sort of barriers, our own closed minds, and try to find ways to build that as a habit beyond the crisis, right? Because the crisis ultimately will be over, but certain things that we do now and certain habits that we form now, some of those will remain. So I think, it's how you look at it. and maybe trying to see some of the opportunities in that is I think, also very important.
Very true. I think there are ample opportunities, and the world has really flattened in terms of interaction and meeting people, and it has come much closer. But I think there is always a possibility, as Akbar has rightly pointed out, that temptations would be there in terms of having resource constraints and other things to really merge the thing, optimally use in the name of optimal use of technology. There is a possibility that the human interaction, the human interface may be really belittled, which is a threat. I personally feel, because when I talk to people, when we get close to each other, when we talk, it's a different environment, it's a different learning, because peer group learning is also important. It's not just about the teacher talk, because lots of information is already available on the net. What else? We will be generating some more information, but I think the peer group learning is the most vital thing, which can only be facilitated on the campus. So I strongly feel that perhaps, given your point of view, is that especially in a country like India, where we need to have a lot of exposure along with just technology. So I think it's time to thank every panelist on behalf of my faculty, on behalf of my teaching fraternity, my student fraternity, and especially while we were talking, I had a message from the Honorable Vice Chancellor that he, despite his busy schedule, he has thanked each of the panelists. On his behalf, I thank you all, and I hope and look forward to have even better convergence and efforts. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you, Professor Saleem, for this really wonderful effort of bringing us together. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Although,
Thank you very much.
although it was a much bigger pleasure seeing you in person in Aligarh and Professor Nawab Ali Khan, but really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Saleem. Thank you, Professor
Thank
Khan.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.